Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It is Friday, February 20th, 2026. And I have to say, looking at the table in front of us today, I am genuinely a little intimidated.
Yeah, it's a formidable stack of paper today, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, usually we have a couple of articles, maybe a newly released book to go through, but today we have government reports, we have these massive academic studies hot off the press from late 2025. We've got institutional data dumps. I can physically feel the weight of this information.
Right.
We're looking at the engine room of knowledge itself today. We are doing a deep dive into the absolute current state of doctoral education.
It is the engine room. And if we stick with that metaphor for a second, the warning lights in that engine room are flashing red.
Bright red.
Blindingly red, honestly.
And I think we need to set the scene for you listening right now, because unless you are currently inside a university system, your image of getting a PhD is probably, well, it's probably a bit romantic.
Oh, totally. This sort of beautiful mind syndrome.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You picture the tweed jackets with the elbow patches. You picture walking across this pristine, leafy campus in New England while the autumn leaves fall gently around you. You picture this life of quiet contemplation. It's the golden ticket, right? You get into a PhD program, you enter this intellectual elite, and you just spend your days thinking big thoughts that change the world.
It's supposed to be this noble, slightly detached existence.
Right.
But that is the brochure. I mean, that is the mythology that universities have sold incredibly well for a century. But the reality contained in these sources we have today, it is starkly, violently different. It doesn't look like a golden ticket at all. It looks like a trap.
A trap.
A completely systemic trap. When we aggregate this data from the 2024 studies all the way up to the new 2026 policy reports, we aren't just seeing a few grumpy grad students complaining about having to grade papers. We are seeing systemic, deep poverty. We're seeing a mental health crisis that rivals active combat zones in some of the psychological metrics. And we are seeing a fundamental breakdown in the very mechanism that produces our scientists and our thinkers.
You know, we have a phrase here in the notes from one of the institutional papers that actually gave me chills. It referred to socioeconomic and career pathologies.
Yeah.
Pathologies. That sounds like a disease.
Well, it is a disease of the system.
Yeah.
We have transitioned from what used to be a niche apprenticeship model, where a master trained an apprentice to eventually take their job to a massified industrial system.
Yeah.
We are churning out PhDs like widgets on a factory line, but the factory itself is broken and the widgets are just being discarded.
So our mission today, the entire point of this deep dive, is to unpack that pathology. We want to understand how the absolute highest level of education a human being can achieve has turned into what one of our sources literally calls suspended adulthood.
Yeah.
We need to figure out why the smartest people in the room are breaking down. And honestly, why you listening to this right now while you commute or while you're at the gym, why you should care about this at all.
Because if the people who discover cancer cures or the people who engineer new battery technologies or decode historical texts, if they are too broken to work, the future gets canceled.
That is the stake right there. So give us the lay of the land. What exactly is in this stack of doom in front of us?
So we have triangulated the truth from a few different angles today. First, we have the Healthy Minds study from the 2024-2025 academic year. This is what gives us the hard, undeniable numbers on the psychology of the modern researcher. Then we have the current policy landscape, specifically reports on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act.
Ah, the OBBB.
The OBBB, yes, which was signed last July.
We absolutely cannot avoid that one. That changed the entire game.
It pulled the rug out completely. We also have these qualitative articles describing the culture of these institutions, including a fascinating, albeit dark, phenomenon called the Gollum effect.
I am so excited to get to the Gollum effect. As a huge Tolkien nerd, seeing that term in a peer-reviewed research paper totally made my day.
It's incredibly evocative, for sure. And finally, we have a global perspective. We are comparing the US system to Europe and looking at the massive, unprecedented changes happening in India right now with the NEP 2020. So we are covering the money, the mind, the culture, and the world.
Okay. Let's start right where the pain is the most acute. The wallet.
The economic precipice.
Let's talk about the stipend. Because there's a huge misconception out there that PhD students are students in the way a 19-year-old undergrad is a student, relying on federal loans or their parents paying tuition. But these are adults. They're employees of the university. They get paid a stipend.
Right. In STEM fields and most of the social sciences, your tuition is waived entirely and you are paid a monthly sum to live on. The university argues this is a living allowance so you can focus 100% of your energy on your research.
Focus. That is the operative word. But can you actually focus on that stipend?
In 2026. Barely. And in many, many cases we looked at, absolutely not. We have to look at the concept of purchasing power. We have a really great breakdown here from a Rice University blog post and the Ph.D. stipends database. You cannot just look at the raw dollar sign. You have to look at the geography of where that university is located.
Because $1 in rural Ohio obviously buys a lot more than $1 in downtown San Francisco.
Exactly. So let's look at the specific data points we pulled for the current academic year. At the very top of the academic food chain, you have Yale University's economics department.
The Ivy League. The 1% of the 1%.
The stipend there is $60,017.
Okay. 60 grand. I'm not going to lie, that actually sounds decent. You're not buying a yacht on that. But as a single person in your late 20s, you can live on $60,000. You can rent a nice apartment, buy organic groceries, maybe even save a little bit for emergencies.
It is dignified. That is a wage that actually respects the work being done. But Yale Economics is a massive outlier. They have an endowment larger than the GDP of some small countries. So let's step down just one rung. Johns Hopkins, human genetics.
We are talking about the people literally researching our DNA, the future of personalized medicine.
They are at $50,000, still livable, right? But it gets tight if you have a family or dependents. But now, let's look at the reality for the vast, vast majority of doctoral students. Let's look at Georgia State University in Atlanta, specifically their computer science department.
Computer science, that's the golden goose right now. Everyone says learn to code if you want to be rich and secure.
Well, if you are getting a PhD in it at Georgia State, the data shows a stipend of roughly $20,166.
Wait, pause. 20,000 a year.
A year in Atlanta in 2026.
I know inflation has cooled slightly since the peak a few years ago, but rent in Atlanta is not cheap. How do you survive on $20,000? That's below the poverty line.
It is deep poverty. The source material explicitly flags this amount as, quote, insufficient for living, unquote. You cannot pay rent, buy food, and pay for basic utilities on that amount. The math physically does not work.
So you were working full-time, probably more than full-time, building complex algorithms, teaching undergraduates, grading hundreds of papers, and you are effectively practically homeless.
Or you are piling up massive, crippling credit card debt just to eat. But hold on, because it actually gets worse.
How does it get worse than literal poverty?
Let's look at the University of Georgia, the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department. When you take the stated stipend and then you subtract the mandatory fees.
The fees. But I thought you just said tuition was waived.
Tuition is waived. But universities have all these other buckets they pull from. Technology fees, health center fees, student activity fees, gym fees. And these are mandatory. And UGA, in this specific department, when you subtract those mandatory fees from the stipend, the data shows a net negative of $700.
A net negative.
You are paying your employer $700 a year for the privilege of working in their lab.
That is indentured servitude. That isn't a job. That's a scam.
It's a massive structural failure. And what's fascinating is that the universities often defend this in their statements by saying, well, you are receiving an education. The true value is in the degree. But you can't eat a degree. You can't pay your landlord with future earning potential.
And this brings up the whole issue of hidden costs, which the sources spend a lot of time on. Because it's not just about rent and groceries. To actually be a PhD, to succeed and get a job afterward, you have to do stuff that costs money.
Correct. The sources highlight unanticipated financial burdens. And the biggest one by far is conferences.
Right. You have to go present your research to the world.
Science is highly social. If you want a postdoc or a faculty job, you have to go to the big annual conferences. Maybe it's in San Francisco this year. Maybe it's in Geneva. Maybe Tokyo. You have to fly there, stay in a hotel, and pay the registration fee, which can be hundreds of dollars alone.
And the department pays for that.
Right.
Like a normal business trip in the corporate world.
In a corporate job, yes, absolutely. In a PhD program, often no. Or they give you a travel grant of maybe $500.
Which covers the Uber to the airport and maybe a stale sandwich at the terminal.
Exactly. So the student is forced to put a $2,000 or $3,000 trip on a high-interest credit card. And this creates a massive equity issue. This is exactly where the class divide absolutely shreds the illusion of a meritocracy.
Right, because if my parents are wealthy, or if I have a spouse who works in high finance or tech, I just go. I swipe the card. I meet the famous professor at the networking mixer. I get the job.
And if you are a first-generation student, if you are sending what little money you have home to help your family, you don't go. You stay in the lab. Your research doesn't get seen by the right people, you don't get the job.
So we are actively filtering out global talent based on their bank balance, not their brain power.
We are re-aristocratizing the academy. It is becoming a hobby for the wealthy again, just like it was in the 18th century. If you look at the demographics, the diversity numbers plummet as you go higher up the academic chain. And this specific financial barrier is a huge part of why.
Which leads directly to the behavior change we're seeing. Because people aren't stupid. If they can't afford to eat, they find a way to eat. The sources call this the working student paradox.
This is a massive cultural shift. I remember even just 10 or 15 years ago, Ph.D. contracts were draconian. They explicitly stated in bold letters, no outside employment. The logic was, we own your time. You are here to think. If you are flipping burgers, you aren't thinking about quantum physics.
The monastic model. You are a monk of science.
Exactly. But you can't be a monk if the monastery literally doesn't feed you. The data shows that now roughly 64% of PhD students supplement their income with external work.
64%. That's the majority.
It is the absolute norm now. They are driving ride shares late at night. They are tutoring rich high school kids for the SATs. They are freelance coding. They are bartending on the weekends.
So you spend 10 hours in the lab running a complicated PCR machine, and then you go spend 6 hours pouring drinks for undergrads.
And here is the paradox. You need the job to survive the degree, but the job makes it profoundly harder to actually get the degree.
It's the cognitive load.
Precisely. We have data from the 2024 Student Financial Wellness Survey. 56% of working students report that their jobs actively interfere with their academic engagement. And it's not just the physical time lost, it's the mental bandwidth. Deep work writing a 300-page dissertation, solving a complex mathematical equation. It requires sustained, uninterrupted focus. If your brain is constantly switching context to, how do I pay the electric bill next week? Or, I really need to pick up a shift on Saturday, your functional IQ effectively drops.
You are trying to run a marathon, but you're wearing a backpack full of rocks.
And the students who don't have to work, the independently wealthy ones, are running that same marathon without the backpack. So of course they finish faster, they publish more papers, they win the awards.
It's a vicious cycle, isn't it? You work to pay for the degree. The outside work slows down your progress on the degree takes longer. You run out of your guaranteed funding years, and then you have to work even more just to finish.
It is the PhD limbo.
Now, we cannot talk about this financial squeeze without talking about the government, because the government just tightened the screws on this entire demographic. We have to talk about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the OBBB.
Yes. Signed into law in July 2025.
Now, for listeners who might have tuned out of the political news cycle last summer, this was the massive omnibus bill. It was pitched to the public primarily as deficit reduction and inflation control.
Right. And the logic, and we should be completely fair to the legislative intent here, regardless of politics, the logic was to streamline federal spending and reduce the government's exposure to high-risk debt. Post-pandemic inflation was incredibly sticky, and they needed to cool the economy down.
That's the macro, 30,000-foot logic. But the micro impact on the people in our stack of papers today.
It was devastating. There were three specific provisions, three levers, really, that the OBBB pulled, which directly hit graduate students.
Walk us through them. Lever one.
The phase out of graduate PILA US loans.
Okay, let's unpack that for a second. What exactly was a Grad PILA US loan?
So regular federal student loans have a strict cap. You can only borrow a certain amount per year. But for years, the Grad PILA US program allowed graduate students to borrow all the way up to what the university calculated as the cost of attendance. So if your stipend was $20,000, but the university said it actually costs $40,000 to live in New York City, you could borrow that $20,000 difference directly from the government.
It wasn't free money. It was debt. You had to pay it back with interest, but it was a lifeline. It meant you could actually buy groceries in a high-cost city.
Exactly. It was the crucial gap funding. Now, the authors of the OBBB argued that this program basically gave universities a blank check to keep their stipends artificially low because they knew the government would always lend the student the difference. So they cut it, they phase it out to, quote unquote, force market discipline.
So the theory was, If students can't borrow the money to survive, the universities will be forced to raise the stipends to attract talent.
That was the economic theory, yes. But in practice, universities are bureaucratic ocean liners. They take years to turn around. So the loan disappeared last July, but the stipends haven't got up yet.
So the safety net just vanished overnight, and the floor hasn't moved an inch. The students just fell straight into the basement.
Correct. Which brings us to lever two, SNAP and Medicaid.
Food stamps and healthcare.
Right. The OBBB shifted a massive amount of the funding and administration for these programs to the individual state budgets, and crucially, it tightened the federal work requirements. Now, historically, being enrolled as a full-time graduate student sometimes exempted you from certain work requirements, or your stipend income didn't count in a way that would automatically disqualify you. The new 2025 rules are much, much stricter.
Wait, so a PhD student working 60 hours a week in a chemistry lab, that doesn't count as work for food stamps?
In many states now, under the new strict interpretation, no, it's classified as training or education. So they are working incredibly hard, but they are ineligible for food assistance because they aren't working in the eyes of the law.
That is just completely Kafkaesque.
It really is. And the third lever was significant changes to Pell Grant eligibility. This was originally meant to stop double dipping, where students stacked multiple institutional scholarships with federal aid. But the unintended fallout is that non-traditional students, say a single mother trying to get a PhD in history, they often get cut off because the new rigid formula no longer accounts for her external childcare costs as a valid educational expense.
So we are systematically purging the entire academic system of anyone who isn't a single, wealthy, childless 22-year-old.
That is the functional outcome of the legislation. The expert analysis in our notes puts it very bluntly. The OBBB forces a binary choice. You either pursue education and risk genuine poverty, and I mean food insecurity poverty, or you abandon the credential entirely to take a job that pays a living wage immediately.
It creates a system where fewer and fewer people can afford the luxury of waiting 5 to 7 years for a payoff.
And that dramatically shrinks the talent pool for the entire nation.
Okay, so that's the wallet. It's empty. But I want to move to the mind because, you can be poor and relatively happy, right? We have the whole cultural trope of the starving artist. But the data in section 2 of our stack suggests these students aren't just hungry, they are deeply suffering.
Section 2, the culture of suffering.
Let's look at the Healthy Mind Study from 2024-2025. This isn't a small sample size, right?
No, not at all. This surveys tens of thousands of students across hundreds of university campuses. It's widely considered the gold standard for mental health data in academia.
And the numbers they're alarming.
They are. Now, there is one tiny, almost microscopic silver lining in the report. Severe depression actually dipped slightly to 18%.
18% is still nearly 1 in 5 people. That's a huge portion of the population.
It is unacceptably high. But the researchers note they are actually more worried about a different metric, a metric called flourishing.
Flourishing, I like that word. It implies so much more than just not being sick.
Exactly. You can be technically not depressed, but still be utterly miserable. Flourishing means you are actively engaged, you're optimistic about the future, you're functioning well socially and cognitively, and flourishing has absolutely plummeted across the board. The metrics show moderate to severe anxiety is sitting at 32 to 33%. Depression overall is at 37%.
But the number that I honestly cannot get out of my head reading this is the suicidal ideation metric.
Yes, 11%.
1 in 10.
In the past 12 months, 11% of doctoral students seriously considered ending their own lives.
That is a staggering, heartbreaking statistic. If 1 in 10 commercial pilots or 1 in 10 accountants were actively thinking about suicide, we would shut down the entire industry. We would have emergency congressional hearings tomorrow morning.
And yet in academia, the response is often silence. Or even worse than silence, normalization.
Right. I was reading the qualitative quotes in the report, this normalization of suffering. One student said, quote, "A PhD is just going to somehow break you," end quote.
It's viewed as a necessary rite of passage. It's intellectual hazing.
Hazing, exactly.
There is this pervasive, toxic narrative in the culture that if you aren't suffering, you aren't doing the science right. Oh, you got 8 hours of sleep last night. Must be nice. I slept under my desk while the centrifuge was running. It's a literal contest of misery.
And what does that culture do to someone who actually realizes they need help?
It creates a massive help-seeking stigma. If suffering is just part of the job description, Then admitting you are struggling means you aren't cut out for the job. You feel like a fundamental failure. So you don't go to the campus counseling center. You don't tell your advisor you're burning out. You just spiral in silence.
You internalize the entire structural failure as a personal flaw.
And this feeds directly biologically into the imposter phenomenon.
The IP. 64% of students score above the clinical cutoff for IP.
2/3 of the people in any given seminar room feel like they do not belong there. And we need to be very clear about the mechanism here. It's not just feeling a bit shy or insecure. Imposter phenomenon mediates self-esteem. As the feeling of I am a total fraud rises, your baseline self-esteem drops. And as self-esteem drops, your actual academic performance literally lowers.
So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
You falsely think you can't do the work. The stress degrades your cognitive function. And so you actually become unable to do the work.
Exactly. The brain literally freezes up. The sources describe two distinct traps that students fall into. One is overstriving. That's the workaholism. You work 100 hours a week just to prove to everyone you aren't a fraud. The other trap is inertia, procrastination. You are so terrified of being exposed as a fraud that you can't even bring yourself to open the Word document to write the paper.
I bet a lot of people listening assume this feeling just goes away over time. Once I get the Ph.D., once I publish my first major paper in Nature, I'll finally feel valid.
The data says, no, that's the real tragedy of it. Growing into the career doesn't fix it. We see data on senior researchers, people with full tenure, people who run massive labs who still feel it. Because the environment itself never actually validates them. It just continuously demands more output.
Speaking of validation, that brings us to arguably the most important relationship in a PhD's entire life. The advisor, the mentor.
This master to the apprentice.
We have a 2026 longitudinal study right here that followed 558 incoming doctoral students. What did it find was the most important factor?
It found that advisor trust is the single biggest predictor of a student's success, not their underlying IQ, not the amount of grant funding the lab has, not the prestigious ranking of the university. Trust. Do I deeply trust that this person has my best long-term career interests at heart?
And do they? Do the students trust them?
The data suggests a massive gaping hole in that trust. Only about 20% of students strongly agree that their advisor even discusses career paths with them.
20%. So 80% are just floating.
Floating in the void. And this immense friction comes from something called role theory. The student sees themselves as a trainee. I am here to learn. Please guide me. But the advisor, who is under immense, crushing pressure from the university to publish papers and bring in grant money, sees the student as a laborer. I hired you to pipette this liquid 5,000 times. Go pipette.
So the student desperately wants a mentor, and the advisor just wants a cheap employee.
And when those two completely different expectations crash into each other, trust evaporates. And when trust is low, the students' distress skyrockets and people just quit. They don't quit science because they hate science. They quit the toxic relationship.
Which is a perfect segue to the most fascinating and honestly the most disturbing concept in our entire stack today. Section 3, systemic pathology, or as the sources formally call it, the Gollum effect.
I knew this is your favorite part of the prep.
It totally is. I mean, it's horrible that it happened, but it's such a sticky, perfect metaphor. For you listening who maybe haven't read The Lord of the Rings recently, explain the Gollum effect.
It's the perfect analogy for academic hoarding. Gollum is a character utterly consumed by his pathological need to hoard the ring. It is precious. He isolates himself in a dark cave. He becomes intensely paranoid of everyone, and he will literally kill to keep anyone else from touching it.
Okay. So who is playing the role of Gollum in the modern university lab?
The senior researcher.
Yeah.
The principal investigator. And the ring in this scenario is data. It's the unique study site. It's the lab resources. The Gollum effect describes an entrenched culture where researchers aggressively hoard these things to the absolute detriment of their colleagues and, very often, specifically their own students.
My precious data set.
Exactly. And the prevalence of this is alarming. 44% of surveyed researchers report having directly experienced this from a superior or colleague.
That is almost half the field. What does this actually look like in practice? Is it just locking a file drawer so someone can't see your notes?
It's much more active and malicious than that. It involves intense gatekeeping. Imagine you are a young anthropologist. You absolutely need access to a specific indigenous tribe or a specific archaeological dig site for your thesis to work. Your advisor is the one who controls the government permit for that site, and they just say no.
Why? Why would they block their own student?
Because they might loosely plan to write a paper about that specific site in 5 years. Or they just don't want you to go in there and find something profound that they missed on their last trip. So they just block your access completely.
That is incredibly petty.
It's active sabotage. There is also a behavior the papers call strategic dissuasion.
Strategic dissuasion. That sounds like CIA Cold War spycraft.
It basically is academic spycraft. It's lying to a junior researcher. You sit them down and tell them, oh, don't pursue that specific experiment. My lab is already doing it and we're about to publish. Or that whole area of inquiry is a complete dead end. Don't waste your time.
But they aren't actually doing the experiment.
No. They just want to keep the territory clear for themselves down the road. They are actively planting psychological landmines to stop you from ever competing with them.
That is actively anti-science. You're literally stopping new human knowledge from being created just to protect your own fragile ego?
It is. It halts progress. And the sources actually bring up a historical example to show that this exact pathology isn't new, it's just scaled up.
Did you catch the bit in the history section about the bone wars?
Yes. This is the story I wanted to make sure we told. The Bone Wars.
Yeah.
Late 1800s, right?
Right. Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. Two absolute giants of early paleontology.
These two guys hated each other with a passion that is frankly hard to describe. They were furiously racing to find new dinosaur bones in the American West, and it wasn't a friendly gentleman's rivalry.
Oh no, they actively bribed each other's dig teams to defect. They wrote scathing articles in national newspapers calling each other complete frauds and thieves. But the part that is true, unadulterated Gollum behavior.
The dynamite.
The dynamite. Marsh would finish digging at a quarry. He would get all his prized fossils out of the rock. And then, instead of leaving the rest of the site intact for the next scientist to study, he would literally fill the pit with dynamite and blow the entire thing up.
He permanently destroyed the fossils. He destroyed the raw data of the Earth, just so Cope couldn't have it.
If I can't have the science, nobody can have the science.
That is the Gollum effect in its purest, most destructive form. And while researchers generally don't use dynamite in 2026, they use encrypted passwords. They use predatory non-disclosure agreements. They use the tactic of pocketing data so it never sees the light of day.
But why? Why do highly educated, incredibly smart people act like this?
Because the institutional system aggressively rewards it. We are operating in a winner-take-all economy. There are very, very few permanent tenure-track jobs available. There are very few massive multi-million-dollar grants. If you don't win those, your career dies. Publish or perish. This extreme zero-sum pressure creates the exact incentive structure to destroy your competition.
And the saddest part of the whole phenomenon is the cycle of abuse.
Yes. The survey shows 20% of the victims of this behavior freely admit to becoming golems themselves later in their careers.
Hurt people, even in labs.
It's a learn and survival strategy. You learn early on that sharing your ideas gets you souped and ruins your career, so you start hoarding. And the whole idealistic culture of open science just dies a slow death.
And the consequence of this publish or perish pressure isn't just hoarding. It pushes people into outright scientific misconduct, right? Faking data.
Exactly. And the penalty is total. Researchers who are officially censured for misconduct face a median 91.8% drop in their career output. It is effectively a career death sentence. The system is perfectly designed to drive productivity, but the pressure of it often destroys the producer in the process.
So we have the crushing poverty of the stipend, we have the mental breakdown and the imposter syndrome, we have toxic mentorship, we have golems blowing up the metaphorical bridges. It is a really bleak picture inside the ivory tower right now.
It is a massive system in deep crisis.
But I want to pivot now, because these people don't just exist in a vacuum inside the lab. They are human beings. They have lives outside, or at least they are desperately trying to. This brings us to section 4, suspended adulthood.
This is the personal cost, the invisible cost that doesn't show up on a university balance sheet.
We have the 2025 American Dream Report in the stack here. It talks extensively about something called the new starting line.
Right. So traditionally, historically, the major milestones of adulthood, buying a home, getting married, having children, those started in your 20s.
Yeah, my parents bought their first house at 24.
Exactly. But for the general population in the US, the median age of first-time homebuyers has shifted dramatically to 40.
40 years old to buy a starter home.
But for PhDs, the delay is even more structurally profound. Because during your absolute prime wealth building years, your 20s and early 30s, you are earning that $20,000 poverty level stipend. You aren't saving for a down payment. You aren't building any home equity. You certainly aren't contributing to a 401k or a retirement fund.
Instead, you're often accumulating debt just to survive the OBBB cuts.
So when you finally graduate and enter the real workforce at 32 or 35 years old, you are financial decades behind your peers who went straight into industry at 22. You are starting the race when everyone else is already on lap 10.
And that financial delay has a very real biological consequence. We have to talk about the fertility crisis in academia.
This is a profound, deeply painful issue, particularly for women in STEM fields. The sources highlight what they call a time squeeze. The tenure clock, which is the grueling 6 or 7 years you have as an assistant professor to prove yourself to get a permanent job, coincides exactly with the biological clock.
They happen at the exact same time in a person's life.
And they are both demanding 100% of your physical and emotional energy. The data shows that female researchers are twice as likely to experience clinical infertility compared to their non-academic peers.
Twice as likely. That is a massive, terrifying discrepancy. Is it just the physical stress of the job?
Stress absolutely plays a biological role, but the main driver is delay. It's called motherhood postponement. There is a deep, often unspoken cultural fear in academia that having a child during a PhD program or a postdoc immediately signals a lack of commitment to the science.
Right. It's the whisper network. Oh, she's not serious about the lab anymore. She's focusing on her family now.
Exactly. It's seen as a fatal weakness. So women wait. They wait until they get the degree. Then they wait until they get the big NIH grant. Then they wait until they get tenure. But by the time all those stars align, they might be 38 or 40 years old. And biology simply doesn't care about your tenure review schedule.
So they try to catch up later.
Which leads to highly expensive fertility treatments, IVF, egg freezing, which, again, they often cannot afford because they've been living on a basic stipend for a decade and have zero savings.
It's a remarkably cruel irony. The people smart enough to literally invent and improve fertility treatments are the ones suffering from it the most because of their career path.
Many just opt for voluntary childlessness, not because they don't deeply want kids, but because the academic career path seems utterly incompatible with having them. It is a massive life choice that the system is essentially making for them.
That is heartbreaking. It really is suspended adulthood. You aren't fully allowed to be a complete person with a family and a house until you have the title and the tenure.
And here is the real kicker of the whole situation. You endure all of this, the poverty, the hazing, the delayed family, the golems, because you believe in the ultimate promise. You believe that at the very end of the rainbow, there's a pot of gold. You tell yourself, I will be a professor.
Which brings us to Section 5, the career disconnect, the fundamental lie at the heart of the system.
The math simply does not work anymore. The vast majority of PhDs in some humanities fields, up to 90%, will never get a tenure-track job. They just don't exist. The universities are not expanding their faculty, they are shrinking it and replacing them with cheap adjuncts.
But the training program itself is still designed as if every single student in the cohort is destined to become a tenured professor at Harvard.
We train lone scholars. We train people to work in deep isolation, to completely own a tiny, hyper-specific niche, to spend 5 years writing a book that maybe 3 other people in the world will ever read.
But if 90% of them are eventually forced to go into private industry, industry doesn't want lone scholars.
No, industry wants teamwork. They want agile project management. They want cross-functional communication skills. They want rapid iteration. So we are spending a decade training people for a job that doesn't exist and actively making them bad at the jobs that actually do exist.
And the salary disparities when they finally do get out, we have the 2024-2025 labor data right here.
It's a complete tale of two cities. If you take your newly minted PhD into IT management, which is a high-growth, high-demand field, the median starting salary is $171,200.
Okay, well, that pays off the credit card loans. You can finally catch up financially.
But if you stay in the humanities, history, English, philosophy, where the academic market is completely saturated and industry demand is lower, the median salary is $64,750.
Ouch. So you are 35 years old. You have a PhD. You are literally one of the top experts in the world in your specific field, and you are making $64K.
And remember, you have permanently lost a decade of compound earning potential. The opportunity cost is devastating. Our expert source in the policy paper emphasizes this point heavily. A humanities PhD is becoming mathematically difficult to justify unless you are already independently wealthy before you start.
It's becoming an extremely expensive, decade-long hobby.
And this disconnect isn't just an American problem, it is global. We have a fascinating comparison here between the US and Europe.
The brain drain.
Look at the starting salaries for new PhD researchers. In the US, across all sectors, the average starting salary is around $103,000.
Okay.
In Europe, the equivalent starting salary is $62,500.
That is a massive gap. It's almost double in the US.
And that is exactly why Europe is bleeding its mindshare. Almost 1 in 4 top-tier scientific researchers currently working in the US were educated abroad. The US is acting like a vacuum, sucking up all the global talent because Europe simply cannot compete with the private dollars and their rigid national salary caps.
But there's another massive player on the board now. India.
The sleeping giant is waking up. India is currently the 4th largest producer of PhDs in the world. They're graduating 24,000 doctoral students a year.
And they are trying to completely overhaul their entire educational system with the NEP 2020, the National Education Policy.
This is an absolutely fascinating social experiment. They are actively trying to fix the silo problem we just talked about. They want to forcefully merge STEM and humanities training, recognizing that the real future innovation happens at the intersection of disciplines.
Right. You desperately need the trained ethicist to talk to the AI coder before the product launches.
Exactly. And to combat the poverty issue, they introduced the Vidya Lakshmi scheme, which provides collateral-free loans to help students with the funding gap.
That sounds great on paper. Much better than the US passing the OBBB and actively cutting loans.
The intent is fantastic, but the source material notes that the actual implementation on the ground is incredibly messy. You have local teachers and administrators who have absolutely no resources or training to manage this huge structural shift. It really highlights a universal truth we've seen throughout this entire deep dive. Policy intent is easy. Execution is incredibly hard. You can pass a grand law in the capital, but changing the entrenched culture of a university takes a generation.
So we have painted a pretty bleak dystopian picture today. We have a global academic system that is visibly creaking under the weight of its own economic and cultural contradictions. But we are not here just to admire the problem. Section 6 of our stack is about solutions. Is there an actual way out of this?
There are some really interesting disruptive models emerging. One that really stands out in the literature is the Ph.D. for the future, specifically looking at the Bristol model over in the UK.
What exactly are they doing differently at Bristol?
They are completely blowing up the lone wolf model we talked about. It's entirely team-based. You enter the program as a cohort. You work together on massive, complex problems.
Like a tech startup team.
Exactly like a startup. And this is the crucial key. They require mandatory 3-month industry internships during the degree.
So you actually see what a real corporate job looks like before you graduate and get dumped into the market.
Yes, you step out of the ivory tower, you experience the pace of the real world, you build a network. And they are also aggressively moving toward portfolio theses.
Instead of writing the giant 300-page book.
Instead of one giant manuscript that just gathers dust on a library shelf, you produce a dynamic portfolio. It includes code repositories, policy briefs, recorded presentations, published articles, things that demonstrate actual, tangible, transferable skills to an employer.
That feels so much more practical. It actually feels like training for the reality of 2026, not the reality of 1926.
It perfectly aligns the training with where the actual jobs are.
But what about the mental health side of the crisis? Can we actually fix the deeply ingrained culture of suffering?
This is significantly harder to solve than the curriculum. There's a huge push right now for digital mental health interventions, DMHIs, basically university-sponsored apps and online asynchronous therapy.
Just download this app and meditate for 5 minutes between your panic attacks.
Basically, yes. The problem the data shows is a massive lack of user uptake. Students download the app, poke around, and completely stop using it after a week.
Well, probably because a meditation app cannot fix a toxic, abusive advisor. And an app certainly cannot pay your Atlanta rent.
Exactly. You cannot yoga your way out of structural poverty. The expert analysis in our stack is totally adamant about this. The solution isn't more wellness apps or free pizza in the student union. It is economic stabilization.
Pay them.
Pay them a living wage, period. And the cultural denormalization of suffering. We as a society have to stop treating misery as a required prerequisite for an advanced degree. We have to stop the intellectual hazing.
If we don't, the whole system just collapses.
It is already collapsing. That is exactly what all this data is trying to warn us about.
So let's wrap this massive journey up. We have gone from the literal poverty of the $20,000 stipends through the dark psychology of the Gollum effect and the mental health crisis, all the way to the delayed adulthood and fertility issues of the modern researcher.
It's been a journey from the wildly systemic to the deeply, painfully personal. And I think the vital key takeaway here is that this isn't just an academic problem that only affects people in tweed jackets.
Right? It's so easy for the average person to say, well, I'm not getting a PhD. Why do I care if they're stressed?
You care because these are the people who are literally tasked with solving our biggest problems. These are the people working on global climate change models, on mRNA cancer vaccines, on AI safety protocols, on preserving and understanding our history. If we systematically burn out our absolute best minds, if we force them into poverty, crush their confidence with imposter syndrome, and isolate them, society as a whole loses.
We lose the future.
We lose the innovations, the medical cures, the profound insights that they would have produced if they were healthy and supported.
It's an invisible graveyard of ideas. The incredible things that didn't get discovered because the discoverer was forced to work a double shift at Starbucks to pay rent, or they just quit entirely because their advisor was a golem.
That is the real terrifying cost to the world.
So here is the final provocative thought for you listening today. Tomorrow, when you think of a PhD, do you think of a noble pursuit of pure knowledge? Or do you see a grueling test of sheer endurance?
Because right now, the hard data says it looks a hell of a lot like a hazing ritual for the intellect.
And we all have to ask ourselves, if the smartest, most capable people in the room are too broke, too anxious, and too isolated to think clearly, what major world problems aren't getting solved right now while we speak? That is the real cost of this crisis. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
See you next time.
We will see you next time.